Welcome to Globewise Entertainment. Today, we're diving into the wild and controversial world of the 1960s, a decade that didn't just change fashion and music, but also shook Hollywood to its core. Believe it or not, some of the most shocking and groundbreaking films of this era were banned, censored, or nearly buried forever. From bold themes to taboo-breaking stories, these are movies that pushed limits the world wasn't ready for. So buckle up as we reveal 10 1960s banned movies that you won't believe existed. And hey, if you haven't subscribed to Globewise Entertainment yet, make sure to hit that button now for more untold stories of Hollywood. Which movie on this list shocks you the most? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from you. 1. Psycho, 1960. When Alfred Hitchcock released Psycho in 1960, no one was prepared for the storm it would unleash. This wasn't just another thriller, it was a film that pushed boundaries Hollywood had carefully avoided for decades. At a time when movie audiences were used to glamorous stars, neatly tied-up endings, and heavily censored content, Psycho tore all of that apart in one shocking slash. The first controversy started with the infamous shower scene. Audiences had never seen such raw terror. A young woman, stabbed to death in what appeared to be graphic detail, accompanied by that shrieking violin score. Even though Hitchcock never showed the knife-piercing flesh, censors believed it was too brutal, too sexual, and far too realistic for the big screen. Some countries, including parts of Europe, temporarily banned or heavily cut the film, insisting it was an assault on morality. But Hitchcock wasn't done shaking things up. He killed off his leading lady, Janet Leigh, only halfway through the movie, something unheard of at the time. To make matters worse, Psycho dared to hint at taboo topics like voyeurism, mental illness, and even cross-dressing. In 1960, this was enough to make studio executives panic and religious groups condemn the film as filth. And then there was Hitchcock's marketing genius. He forbade theaters from letting audiences in once the movie had started, creating lines around the block and a frenzy of curiosity. What was this terrifying movie that critics called disgusting, yet audiences couldn't stop talking about? Ironically, the controversy only fueled its success. While Psycho was banned or censored in several countries and heavily criticized in the United States, it went on to become one of the most profitable films of the decade and a turning point in horror cinema. Today, that once-banned shower scene is considered one of the most iconic moments in film history. Psycho proved something powerful. Sometimes what the censors try to silence becomes the very thing that cements a movie's legacy. 2. The Trip, 1967. Roger Corman's psychedelic nightmare. In 1967, Roger Corman, already known as the king of the B-movies, decided to push cinema into uncharted territory. The Trip wasn't just a film, it was a kaleidoscopic experiment that threw audiences straight into the psychedelic counterculture of the late 60s. Written by Jack Nicholson, yes, before The Shining made him a Hollywood legend, this movie set out to explore the unfiltered, hallucinatory world of LSD. The plot follows a television commercial director, played by Peter Fonda, who decides to embark on his very first acid trip after a messy divorce. What follows is not a standard narrative, but a cinematic fever dream. Viewers were hit with swirling colors, surreal montages, distorted realities, and symbolic imagery, from death and rebirth sequences to visions of cosmic landscapes. At times, the film felt like a spiritual awakening. At others, a terrifying descent into paranoia. But what really made The Trip controversial wasn't just its subject, it was the honesty of its depiction. At a time when LSD was at the center of the counterculture revolution and undergoing scrutiny by the US government, this movie didn't condemn or warn against the drug. Instead, it treated the psychedelic experience as both enlightening and dangerous, leaving the audience to decide for themselves. That neutrality was enough to send alarm bells ringing across Hollywood and Washington. The film was slapped with a ban in several regions, and the British Board of Film Censors outright refused to grant it a certificate, essentially keeping it out of UK theaters. In the US, it was heavily criticized for supposedly glamorizing drug use during a time when authorities were already cracking down on hippie culture. Ironically, its controversy only fueled its popularity, making it a cult classic among young audiences who felt it mirrored their own countercultural journeys. Adding to its rebellious aura was its production. Corman himself admitted that he experimented with LSD before making the film, wanting to capture the visuals and sensations authentically. Nicholson, Fonda, and Dennis Hopper, who later reunited for Easy Rider, were already icons of youth rebellion, and their involvement gave the trip a dangerous edge. Over time, what was once considered subversive has become historic. Today, the trip is remembered not only as a banned psychedelic experiment but also as a cultural time capsule. It captured the spirit of a decade defined by freedom, rebellion, and a hunger for altered consciousness, whether society was ready for it or not. 3. Wild in the Streets, 1968. In the late 1960s, America was at a breaking point. Youth counterculture, protests against the Vietnam War, and distrust of authority were reaching a fever pitch. Into this turbulent time came Wild in the Streets, 1968, a dark satirical film that shocked audiences and rattled censors worldwide. The movie tells the story of Max Frost, a 22-year-old rock star who becomes a political sensation. At first, his music is about rebellion and freedom, but things spiral when he leads a youth movement demanding the voting age be lowered to 14 years old. What begins as a countercultural fantasy quickly turns nightmarish. Frost wins power, floods Congress with teenagers, and sends anyone over the age of 30 to government-run concentration camps, where they're forcibly drugged with LSD to keep them docile. It was a shocking vision of generational warfare, a world where the young literally destroyed the old. For 1968 audiences, already on edge with real student uprisings and political assassinations, the film felt dangerously close to reality. Critics called it the most terrifying political fantasy ever filmed. Censors in several countries, including parts of Europe and Australia, banned or heavily cut the film. Authorities argued it was incitement to rebellion and too subversive for young audiences. Even in the United States, theaters were pressured to pull screenings after conservative groups claimed the movie glamorized drugs, riots, and the destruction of democracy. Ironically, Wild in the Streets wasn't meant to be a call to revolution but a satirical warning about what happens when political extremism takes hold. Yet, its imagery, youth armies, LSD as a weapon, and the overthrow of authority was so powerful that it terrified governments across the globe. Today, the movie is a cult classic, both campy and chilling, but at the time it was one of the most controversial films of the decade. It forced audiences to ask, what happens when the revolution goes too far? 4. Midnight Cowboy, 1969. When Midnight Cowboy hit theaters in 1969, it shocked audiences and censors alike. Directed by John Schlesinger and starring Jon Voight and Dustin Hoffman, the film was gritty, raw, and brutally honest about subjects Hollywood had long avoided. At its heart, it told the story of Joe Buck, a naive Texas dishwasher who heads to New York City dreaming of becoming a male hustler. Instead of glamour, he finds loneliness, exploitation, and an unlikely friendship with a sickly con man named Ratso Rizzo. What made Midnight Cowboy truly controversial was its unapologetic depiction of prostitution, homosexuality, drug use, and poverty, all taboo topics in mainstream cinema at the time. The Motion Picture Association of America slapped it with an X rating, making it the first and only X-rated film to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. That rating alone ensured controversy, since X was often associated with pornography. Many theaters refused to screen it, and some countries outright banned it, claiming it was immoral and dangerous for audiences. Critics were split. Some hailed it as a groundbreaking masterpiece exposing America's hidden underbelly, while others condemned it as obscene and degrading. Yet despite the bans and outrage, Midnight Cowboy triumphed. It won 3 Oscars, including Best Director and Best Adapted Screenplay, and changed the way Hollywood approached storytelling. It proved that audiences were ready for films that reflected reality, dark, uncomfortable, and unpolished. Today, the movie stands as a cultural landmark, remembered not just for Dustin Hoffman's legendary line, "I'm walkin' here," but for breaking barriers in what cinema could dare to show. What once was banned is now celebrated as art. 5. The Man with the Golden Arm, 1960. Long before Hollywood openly addressed addiction on screen, The Man with the Golden Arm shocked audiences by tackling a subject most studios refused to touch: heroin. The film starred the legendary Frank Sinatra in one of his most daring roles, playing Frankie Machine, a Chicago drummer fresh out of rehab who's trying to rebuild his life. Instead of focusing on glamorous Hollywood tropes, the movie took a raw, unfiltered look at withdrawal, relapse, and the harsh grip of drug dependency, subjects that were considered taboo in the early 1960s. At the time, the Motion Picture Production Code, the infamous Hays Code, still controlled what could and could not be shown on screen. Explicit references to drug use were forbidden, which made Otto Preminger's film a direct challenge to censorship. In fact, when the movie was first released, many theaters refused to show it because it carried no official seal of approval from the code. Some cities outright banned the film, claiming it was too corrupting for public viewing. But audiences and critics had a very different reaction. Sinatra's performance was hailed as one of the best of his career, even earning him an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. More importantly, the controversy surrounding the movie forced the industry to re-evaluate its outdated censorship rules. Within a few years, Hollywood moved toward the modern MPAA rating system, allowing filmmakers to tackle real-world issues without as much restriction. So while The Man with the Golden Arm may have scandalized censors in the 1960s, today it's remembered as a groundbreaking classic that paved the way for more honest storytelling in cinema. 6. Dr. Strangelove, 1964. Too close to reality. Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, wasn't just another Cold War satire. It was a bold cinematic grenade lobbed directly at the world's most sensitive political nerves. Released in 1964 at the height of nuclear paranoia, the film dared to laugh at the very real possibility of global annihilation. The story follows an unhinged U.S. general who unilaterally orders a nuclear strike on the Soviet Union, sparking a frantic scramble in Washington to stop it. What made the film dangerous wasn't just its biting humor, it was how disturbingly plausible it felt. The bumbling politicians, the mad scientist in a wheelchair, the trigger-happy military men, all of them reflected anxieties about real-world leaders with their fingers on the button. But Dr. Strangelove didn't just ruffle feathers, it triggered bans. In Spain under Franco's dictatorship, the film was deemed offensive and subversive, and it was outright prohibited. In several NATO-aligned countries, screenings were restricted, cut, or delayed because the satire was seen as undermining public trust in military institutions. Even in the U.S., Columbia Pictures was pressured to tone down or cut scenes that made the military look reckless and incompetent. One of the film's most infamous bans came from the British government, which briefly stopped its release because of a scene mentioning the deadly crash of the B-52 bomber. Just weeks before the film's premiere, a real B-52 carrying nuclear weapons crashed in Greenland, creating eerie parallels that felt less like satire and more like dangerous truth-telling. Despite the censorship battles, Dr. Strangelove became a cultural milestone, proving that comedy could be more terrifying than horror when aimed at the possibility of nuclear war. Today, it's hailed as one of the greatest films ever made, but in the 1960s, it was a movie so bold and unflinching that governments feared its laughter could spark panic. 7. The Pawnbroker, 1964. In 1964, director Sidney Lumet released a film that shook Hollywood and censorship boards across America. The Pawnbroker tells the haunting story of Sol Nazerman, a Holocaust survivor living in Harlem, who runs a pawn shop while battling deep trauma from his past. Played masterfully by Rod Steiger, Soul is a man who has shut himself off emotionally, burying his humanity under cynicism and bitterness. But it wasn't just the powerful themes of guilt, survival, and trauma that made this film so controversial, it was the way Lumet chose to tell it. For the first time in American mainstream cinema, the Pawnbroker dared to include nudity in a serious dramatic context. In one striking scene, a prostitute exposes her breasts while taunting Soul, symbolizing his inability to reconnect with intimacy or desire after the horrors of the Holocaust. This brief but daring moment put the film head-to-head with the Hollywood production code, the strict set of rules that had dictated morality in cinema since the 1930s. According to the code, nudity of any kind was absolutely forbidden, but Lumet refused to cut the scene. Shockingly, after much debate, the censors allowed the Pawnbroker to be released uncut, marking the very first time the code was officially bent to allow nudity in an American studio film. The backlash was enormous. Religious groups condemned the movie for its immorality, while others praised it as a courageous step forward for artistic freedom. In fact, this controversy became one of the first cracks in the wall of the production code system, paving the way for the MPAA rating system that arrived just a few years later. Despite the uproar, the Pawnbroker earned 4 Academy Award nominations, and Rod Steiger's performance is still considered one of the greatest of the decade. But beyond its awards and accolades, the film's legacy rests on how it challenged censorship and helped Hollywood transition into a new, more honest era of filmmaking. For audiences in the 1960s, it was a shocking revelation. For us today, it's a reminder of how one bold film helped dismantle decades of censorship and open the door for modern cinema as we know it. 8. Splendor in the Grass, 1961. Desire, Repression, and Hollywood's Moral Boundaries. When Splendor in the Grass hit theaters in 1961, audiences were stunned, not just by its tragic love story, but by the fact that Hollywood dared to put such raw emotional and sexual turmoil on screen. Directed by Elia Kazan and starring Natalie Wood and Warren Beatty in his breakout role, the film pushed far beyond the safe limits of the 1950s studio system. At its heart, the story explored the destructive force of sexual repression in conservative America. Natalie Wood played Deanie, a young woman deeply in love with Bud, Warren Beatty. Their passion is undeniable, but social pressures, family expectations, and a strict moral code demand restraint. Deanie's struggle between her desires and society's rules ultimately leads her into a heartbreaking psychological breakdown. For 1961, this was explosive. The production code, which still dictated what was morally acceptable on screen, had long banned direct references to teenage sexuality, masturbation, and the emotional toll of repression. Yet Splendor in the Grass tackled these topics head-on, wrapped inside a beautifully tragic romance. In fact, one line from the film, when Deanie desperately asks if it's normal for girls to feel what she feels, sent shockwaves through conservative groups. Critics labeled it immoral, too explicit, and dangerous for impressionable youth. In several regions of the U.S., the film was either censored or outright banned, while abroad, countries like Spain and Ireland blocked its release entirely for indecency. But here's the twist, its controversy made it iconic. Natalie Wood's haunting performance earned her an Academy Award nomination, and William Inge's screenplay went on to win the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay. More importantly, Splendor in the Grass opened the door for Hollywood to confront sexual repression, mental health struggles, and the darker truths of coming of age. Today, it's remembered not only as a passionate and heartbreaking love story, but as one of the boldest early challenges to Hollywood censorship. What was once banned for being too scandalous is now celebrated as a landmark in cinematic honesty. 9. Lolita, 1962. The film that shocked censors worldwide. When Stanley Kubrick announced he was adapting Vladimir Nabokov's controversial novel Lolita, Hollywood executives were terrified. The book, already infamous for its taboo subject matter, a middle-aged professor's obsession with a 14-year-old girl, was seen as unfilmable. Yet Kubrick, known for pushing cinematic boundaries, was determined to bring it to the big screen. To navigate strict censorship under the Hollywood production code, Kubrick made the character of Lolita older than in the novel, played by 14-year-old Sue Lyon, but presented as 16 in the film. Even with these changes, the film sparked outrage. Religious groups, moral watchdogs, and even government officials condemned it before it was released. In the US, the Motion Picture Association nearly refused to give it approval. In Britain, censors demanded major cuts before audiences could see it. Spain, parts of Latin America, and the Middle East outright banned it, declaring it immoral and dangerous to public decency. Despite the controversy, or maybe because of it, Lolita became a box office sensation. Audiences were drawn to the mystery, the tension, and Kubrick's daring approach to forbidden desire. The poster itself, featuring Sue Lyon in heart-shaped sunglasses licking a lollipop, became one of the most provocative images in movie history. Looking back, Kubrick admitted he felt limited by censorship and that the film could never truly capture Nabokov's unsettling story. But that might be exactly why Lolita endures. It forced audiences to question where the line between art and obscenity should be drawn. Even today, Lolita remains one of the most debated films of the 1960s, praised for its style, condemned for its subject, and remembered as a movie that dared to exist when the world wasn't ready for it. 10. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? 1966. When Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf premiered in 1966, it didn't just shake audiences, it shook the entire Hollywood censorship system. Directed by Mike Nichols and starring real-life couple Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, this psychological drama pushed film boundaries to their absolute breaking point. The movie adapted Edward Albee's stage play about a bitter, aging couple who unleash their frustrations during a night of alcohol-fueled emotional warfare. It wasn't the subject matter that made censors panic, it was the raw, unfiltered language. Audiences at the time weren't used to hearing profanity, sexual references, and gut-punching insults thrown around in a major Hollywood production. In fact, the film was the first to be released under the MPAA's newly reformed rating system, replacing the outdated production code. Before this, studios had to follow strict rules that banned profanity, suggestive themes, or anything deemed immoral. But Taylor and Burton's brutal verbal sparring broke those rules wide open. Lines like "screw you," references to sexual impotence, and heavy drinking scenes pushed the film into uncharted territory. Censors demanded edits, but Nichols and Warner Brothers refused. Instead, the studio fought back, and the movie was released almost intact, earning a restricted rating, which meant children under 18 couldn't see it without an adult. At the time, this was revolutionary. The controversy only fueled its popularity, making it one of the most talked about films of the 1960s. What's more shocking? Despite being too obscene for many theaters, the film went on to win 5 Academy Awards, including Elizabeth Taylor's second Oscar for Best Actress. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece of realism, proving that Hollywood could make serious, adult films without bowing to censorship. In the end, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf wasn't just a banned movie, it was the movie that helped kill Hollywood's old censorship system and pave the way for the modern ratings system we still use today. Without it, cinema as we know it might look very different. And there you have it, 10 shocking films from the 1960s that were banned, censored, or nearly erased from history. These movies didn't just stir controversy, they challenged society, reshaped Hollywood, and proved that cinema could be bold, daring, and unforgettable. Which of these films surprised you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments, we'd love to know your pick. And if you haven't subscribed to Globewise Entertainment yet, now's the time. Hit that subscribe button and join us for more incredible stories from the hidden corners of Hollywood. Until next time, keep exploring the movies that made history, both the ones they wanted you to see and the ones they tried to hide.